Before this story begins, understand something. There was no moment when France was officially told that it would be allowed to starve. No announcement, no decree, no villain standing on a balcony smiling. What happened was quieter, more reasonable, more dangerous, because every step made sense to someone. Bread prices rose, temporarily. Grain shipments were delayed, logistically. Reforms were postponed, responsibly. And while those explanations circulated, people stopped eating. Not dramatically, not all at once, but meal by meal, day by day, until hunger stopped feeling like an emergency and started feeling like a condition of life. This is not a story about cruelty. It is a story about distance, about what happens when those in power do not hate the suffering, they simply do not feel it. Because history does not collapse when someone pulls a trigger. It collapses when someone decides to wait. In this video, you will not hear shouting. You will not hear villains monologuing. You will not hear a single moment where everything suddenly goes wrong. Instead, you will hear something slower. You will hear how hunger moves through paperwork, through tradition, through polite hesitation, through closed doors. And by the end of this story, you may find yourself asking a question history rarely answers directly. Not who caused the suffering, but who noticed it and chose not to interrupt. This is the story of a queen who did not pull the trigger. She closed the doors. No one screamed when France began to starve. No one screamed when France began to starve. There were no alarms, no proclamations, no royal orders demanding silence. Hunger arrived politely. It waited. It sat at the edges of villages, inside empty kitchens, behind the eyes of mothers who stopped serving themselves food so their children could eat. And while France learned how to live on less, the palace gates stayed closed. Inside Versailles, the ovens remained warm, tables were set, candles were lit, music played softly enough not to disturb digestion. No command was given to starve the country. No executioner was hired. No blood was spilled at first. The doors were simply not opened. And sometimes that is enough. This is the story of a queen who did not pull the trigger. She closed the doors. France did not collapse in flames. It collapsed in portions, in smaller loaves, in thinner soups, in meals skipped quietly, without complaint. By the late 1780s, bread was no longer a certainty. It was a calculation. Families measured hunger the way merchants measured grain, carefully, desperately, always aware that tomorrow might be worse. A working man spent nearly half his wages on bread alone. When prices rose, there was nothing left to cut, no meat to remove, no luxury to surrender, only food. And when food disappears, something else follows: patience. In villages outside Paris, grain carts began traveling with armed escorts, not because the grain was valuable, but because the people were starving. Mothers stood in line for hours, sometimes days, only to be told there was nothing left. Children learned not to ask for more. The old learned how to lie still to preserve strength. And far away, behind walls designed to keep reality out, Versailles remained untouched, not because the court was evil, but because it was insulated. Versailles was not merely a palace, it was a system, a controlled environment where hunger could not easily enter. The kitchens alone employed hundreds. Food arrived daily, fresh bread, pastries, wine, meat. Menus were planned weeks in advance, not as indulgence, but as routine. Marie Antoinette lived inside this routine. She woke to servants. She ate what was placed before her. She attended ceremonies designed to remind everyone present that the monarchy was eternal, stable, and untouched. And stability, when carefully maintained, becomes blindness. When reports arrived of rising bread prices, they were summarized, softened, translated into numbers. Numbers do not scream. Numbers do not cry. Numbers do not look like children with swollen bellies. And so the court continued, not because it hated the people, but because it never truly saw them. Marie Antoinette did not walk through starving villages. She did not stand in bread lines. She did not hear the sound hunger makes at night, the quiet restlessness, the shallow breathing, the slow understanding that sleep will not bring relief. She heard music. She heard gossip. She heard criticism about her clothes, her tastes, her spending. But hunger was filtered, abstract, a rumor, something ministers discussed so that she wouldn't have to. And in this distance, neglect grew. When unrest began to stir, when murmurs of famine became harder to ignore, the response was not violence, it was delay. Meetings postponed, reforms discussed but not enacted. Responsibility passed from one office to another. No one said no, they simply did not say yes. Grain was not released quickly enough. Price controls were debated too long. Relief was considered later. And outside the gates, later meant starvation. Versailles did not collapse, it endured. And endurance in times of suffering can be indistinguishable from cruelty. This is the story of a queen who did not pull the trigger. She closed the doors.
Hunger is not sudden. It is administrative. It is paperwork, delayed shipments, debated policies, and unanswered petitions. By 1788, France did not lack food. It lacked access. Granaries were not empty. They were locked. Grain still existed in the kingdom, stored, traded, exported, speculated upon. Merchants held supplies, waiting for prices to rise. Officials argued whether intervention would disrupt the natural order of the market. The monarchy hesitated, because to interfere would be to admit weakness, and weakness was dangerous. Bread was not just food, it was stability, and stability, once disturbed, does not return quietly. The price of a loaf. For centuries, the French people lived under an unspoken agreement. As long as bread was affordable, they would endure almost anything. Taxes, labor, silence. But when bread prices rose beyond reach, the agreement broke. In Paris, the price of a single loaf consumed nearly a full day's wage. Imagine working from sunrise to dusk only to earn enough to eat once. And then imagine prices rising again. People did not riot at first. They waited.
They hoped. They assumed someone above them was fixing the problem. Someone always is, until they aren't. Reports that never felt urgent. Versailles received reports, carefully written, respectfully worded. They spoke of shortages, of unrest, of growing anger among the poor. But reports are quiet things. They sit on desks, they wait to be read. They do not interrupt dinners. They do not halt performances. Marie Antoinette saw summaries. She trusted ministers. She trusted systems that had existed long before her. And systems, when failing, rarely announce it clearly. They degrade politely. The economics of detachment. The royal court continued to spend, not excessively by its own standards, just normally. And that was the problem. Normal no longer existed outside the palace. While peasants diluted soup with water, Versailles planned festivals. While children learned to sleep hungry, courtiers debated fashion. This was not mockery, it was insulation. The palace existed in a different economy, one where hunger was theoretical, one where food arrived regardless of price, one where scarcity could not cross the gates. And because the court was fed, it assumed the kingdom could wait. When hunger turns into memory. In villages, hunger began to change behavior. People stopped speaking openly. They conserved breath. They conserved movement. They conserved hope. Children forgot what fullness felt like. The elderly disappeared quietly, not through violence, through absence. Deaths went uncounted, not because they were hidden, but because they became routine. Starvation does not shock, it erodes. Silence as policy. No decree announced that relief would not come. No law forbade mercy. There was simply hesitation, delay, concern about precedent, concern about cost, concern about image. Each concern reasonable in isolation, together lethal. Marie Antoinette did not intervene decisively, not because she wished suffering, but because she believed stability required restraint, and restraint in famine is indistinguishable from abandonment. The doors remained closed. Versailles did not barricade itself. It did not declare hostility. It simply maintained its schedule. Meals were served. Ceremonies continued. Walls did what walls are meant to do. They kept things out, including reality. And outside those walls, hunger learned something important, that no one was coming. When people realize they are alone, they change. The slow death of patience. Hunger does not immediately create anger, it creates calculation. People ask themselves how long they can endure, 1 week, 1 month, and other winter. But eventually, calculation turns into certainty that nothing is going to change. By the time riots began, France had already accepted abandonment. The anger came later. First came the understanding. Women at the bread lines. It was women who stood in line, women who waited for hours, women who returned home with empty baskets, women who absorbed the stares of children expecting food. Men could riot, women had to explain, and explanations run out quickly. When women marched later, it was not politics, it was arithmetic. There was no bread, and someone had to answer for that. The Queen as symbol. Marie Antoinette became a symbol before she became a target. Her image traveled faster than her decisions. Pamphlets exaggerated, cartoons lied, but they worked because symbols do not need accuracy, they need contrast. A fed queen in a starving country is enough, even if the image is unfair, even if the reality is complex. Hunger simplifies morality. The moment it could have changed. There were moments when decisive action could have softened the collapse. Grain releases, price controls, public acknowledgement, visibility. But decisive action risks authority, and authority, once questioned, rarely recovers. The monarchy chose preservation, and in doing so, lost everything. The court still ate, France still starved, and patience, once legendary, finally died. The March on Versailles did not begin as a revolution. It began as a journey. Women left Paris in small groups, some barefoot, some carrying kitchen knives, not as weapons, but as tools, some carrying nothing at all. They did not chant at first. They talked about bread, about children, about how long it had been since anyone in their homes had eaten properly. This was not fury, it was momentum. And momentum, once gathered, does not require leadership. The distance between palace and street. Versailles was close, close enough that it should have known, close enough that silence became intentional. As the crowd grew, so did its purpose, not to overthrow, not to execute, but to be seen. Hunger, for months, had been invisible. Now it was walking. Inside the palace. Versailles learned of the march gradually. Messengers arrived, voices lowered, schedules adjusted. Marie Antoinette was informed, not with urgency, with caution, because panic spreads, and the palace was trained never to panic. She was told the people wanted bread. She was told it would be handled. Handled, the most dangerous word in a collapsing system. A queen confronted by consequence. When the crowd reached Versailles, they were exhausted, wet, cold, hungry. They stood before gates that had never opened for them, gates that had quietly shaped their suffering. This was not rage seeking blood. This was need demanding acknowledgement. Marie Antoinette did not flee. She did not hide. She hesitated. And hesitation in that moment spoke louder than refusal. The sound of a crowd that has waited too long. Crowds are often described as loud. This one was not. It murmured, it pressed, it waited. And waiting, when stretched too far, becomes threat. The queen eventually appeared, not to promise, not to confess, but to perform reassurance. Words were spoken, gestures made, bread promised. The doors at last opened, not wide, but enough. What the people saw. They did not see a monster. They saw a woman dressed better than they had ever been, fed in a way they had forgotten was possible, protected, calm. And contrast does not require cruelty to feel cruel. The queen did not cause their hunger, but she embodied their exclusion. The moment the monarchy lost its distance. From that day forward, the palace could no longer pretend it was separate. The people had arrived. Hunger had crossed the gates. The illusion of insulation collapsed. Marie Antoinette would never again be distant enough to remain symbolic. She was now present, and presence demands responsibility. But responsibility was already too late. The return to Paris. The royal family was escorted back, not as prisoners, not as rulers, as figures caught between roles. The court followed, the food followed, the illusion stayed behind. Versailles was no longer a refuge, it was a memory. The doors had opened, but the damage was done. When the royal family entered Paris, they did not arrive as conquerors. They arrived as reminders. Every carriage wheel turning through the streets made one truth impossible to ignore. The monarchy now lived among the hungry, not as equals, not as saviors, as witnesses. And witnesses, once exposed, are judged. The palace without walls. The Tuileries Palace was not Versailles. It lacked isolation. It lacked ceremony. It lacked the illusion of infinity. Outside its gates, people waited, not to attack, to watch, to count meals, to notice whether the windows glowed at night with candlelight. Every sign of comfort became evidence. Hunger becomes personal. The people no longer blamed systems. Systems are invisible. They blamed faces, and the most recognizable face was hers. Pamphlets multiplied, stories twisted, some false, some exaggerated, all effective. The phrase, "let them eat cake," spread not because it was true, but because it felt true. It expressed distance. It expressed misunderstanding. It expressed everything hunger resents. Marie Antoinette under observation. The queen adjusted. She wore simpler clothes. She attempted restraint. But restraint after abundance reads as performance. Every effort came too late. Because hunger does not forgive timing errors, and history does not forgive symbols. Food as suspicion. Even acts of charity were doubted. Bread distributions were watched. Every loaf counted. Every gesture interpreted. The queen could no longer eat privately, because privacy itself had become offensive. She had not starved, and that fact followed her everywhere. The monarchy trapped by its own image. Marie Antoinette was not given the chance to be ordinary. She was either a monster or a myth, and myths are easier to destroy than systems. As shortages continued, as reforms stalled, the public needed someone to absorb their suffering, and she was available. When silence became guilt, the queen spoke less. Every word was dissected. Every absence was interpreted as indifference. Silence, once protective, now condemned her. She had closed the doors when it mattered. Now no door could protect her. The final transformation. By the time violence returned, by the time anger sharpened, the narrative was already written. She was not judged for what she did. She was judged for what she represented. A life uninterrupted by hunger, in a country that had learned to measure time by empty stomachs. This was not justice. It was inevitability. Revolutions are often described as explosions. France's collapse was erosion. By the time violence arrived, the damage had already been done quietly. Trust had thinned. Patience had vanished. Hunger had rewritten morality. No single decision caused this, and that made it harder to stop. The failure of correction. There were attempts, reforms discussed, committees formed, prices debated, relief measures announced. But systems under starvation do not respond to deliberation. They respond to action. And action, when delayed too long, becomes symbolic rather than effective. Bread arrived too late. Words followed even later. The damage did not reverse. Marie Antoinette as an afterthought. By now, the Queen was no longer the center of events. She was already history. The revolution moved past her, past blame, past reason. It no longer needed a cause. It had momentum. And momentum does not stop to reconsider fairness. The economy of desperation. Hunger had trained people to think differently, short-term, urgently. Morality simplified. Survival replaced patience. Actions once unthinkable became reasonable. Stealing bread was no longer theft. It was arithmetic. If the system would not feed you, you fed yourself. When power lost meaning. The monarchy still existed on paper. Ceremonies continued. Titles remained. But power requires belief, and belief cannot survive prolonged hunger. Marie Antoinette had not lost power through malice. She lost it through irrelevance, the worst fate for authority. The myth finalized. Stories hardened. The Queen's image froze. No nuance survived. History rarely allows complexity when starvation is involved. She became the woman who did not care, the queen who feasted while others starved. Whether true or not no longer mattered, because hunger does not preserve accuracy, it preserves resentment. The moment the end became certain. Long before the trial, long before imprisonment, long before execution, the monarchy had already ended, not with violence, but with abandonment. The people stopped expecting help, and when expectation dies, so does legitimacy. What followed was not justice. It was conclusion. When Marie Antoinette was finally brought to trial, the country was no longer hungry, not in the way it had been. The famine had passed. The riots had settled. The urgency had burned itself out. What remained was memory, and memory is sharper than hunger. A woman long after her role ended. By the time she stood before her judges, Marie Antoinette was no longer a queen. She was no longer a symbol. She was a remainder, a fragment of an era people wanted to forget. Her crimes were listed, some real, some imagined, most irrelevant, because the verdict had been reached years earlier, when the bread ran out. Guilt without intent. Marie Antoinette did not design the famine. She did not order starvation. She did not rejoice in suffering. But intent is not required for guilt in the court of history, only contrast. She lived uninterrupted. They did not. And in times of collapse, that difference becomes unforgivable. The quiet walk. On the day of her execution, there was no chaos, no grand moment, no spectacle worthy of myth. Just a woman walking, thin, tired, older than her years. She did not scream. She did not plead. The crowd did not rage. They watched, as if confirming something already decided. What the blade actually cut. The guillotine did not end hunger. It did not restore bread. It did not correct economic injustice. It did one thing only. It closed a story. The blade was not vengeance. It was punctuation. The doors remembered. Long after the monarchy fell, long after the revolution consumed itself, people remembered something simpler than politics. They remembered doors that stayed closed. They remembered meals that continued. They remembered silence when hunger asked for help. And memory does not require malice to condemn. The real lesson. History often asks whether Marie Antoinette deserved her fate. That is the wrong question. The correct one is quieter. What happens when those in power do nothing while those below them starve? The answer is not immediate. It takes years. It takes patience. It takes erosion. But it always arrives. France did not execute a woman. It executed neglect. History prefers endings that feel complete. A blade, a verdict, a silence. But societies do not heal when a story ends. They continue carrying what caused it. France did not wake up fed the day after the execution. Bread did not suddenly become abundant. Inequality did not vanish. The hunger that had shaped the revolution did not disappear. It simply changed form. What execution could not fix. The guillotine removed a person. It did not remove scarcity. It did not rewrite economic reality. It did not teach systems empathy. The poor were still poor. The vulnerable were still expendable. And the structures that allowed starvation to spread remained largely intact. Revolutions are efficient at destruction. They are slower at nourishment. The myth hardens. As years passed, Marie Antoinette stopped being human. She became a lesson, a warning, a caricature. History simplified her because complexity makes reflection uncomfortable. It is easier to believe she was cruel than to admit she was distant, because distance is easier to repeat. When starvation returns, quietly, France would experience hunger again, not always famine, sometimes unemployment, sometimes inflation, sometimes neglect disguised as reform, and each time the memory resurfaced, not her name, but the feeling that someone, somewhere, was eating uninterrupted. The most dangerous form of power. Marie Antoinette's greatest mistake was not extravagance, it was invisibility. She did not witness hunger directly, and power that does not witness suffering will always underestimate it. That lesson outlived her. It outlived the monarchy. It still exists. Why this story does not end. Because this is not a story about a queen. It is a story about thresholds. The moment when hunger stops being personal and becomes political. The moment when silence becomes betrayal. The moment when doing nothing becomes an act history remembers. The final image. Imagine a closed door, not slammed, not guarded, just unopened. On one side, warmth, light, food. On the other, waiting. That door is history's most common instrument, and it never needs to be locked. If you listened to this entire story, you did not do so for entertainment. You listened because something in it felt familiar, because history does not repeat through villains, but through habits, through delay, through comfort, through closed doors. This has been NOXHOUR, and the past is never finished speaking.